conclude from our very brief analysis is that the WHO recommendations may be fair, but they aren't necessarily leading to effective disease control long term. And again, we only looked at women's and rural and urban areas. We looked at other things that might be different. But there's a bunch of shortcomings to this analysis, of course. First, we only tested one set of parameters. And I failed to mention before that the set of parameters we chose was actually a very extensively researched set of parameters. So we did a large literature search and we ran a sensitivity analysis to choose this set of parameters. So I'm fairly confident that the parameters we chose are accurately representing the dynamics that we should see. But again, it's only one set. And for us to be confident about our conclusions, we should be able to test many more. And we use data from published sources. And some of you might be saying, well, why is that a shortcoming? That should be something that's actually a good thing. But it's been found that in sub-Saharan Africa, men actually over-report their sexual activity. And so you're getting a misrepresentation of what's actually occurring in real life. And so using data from published sources might not be the best thing. But again, what other data could you use for this sort of analysis? So future work would be incorporating same-sex interactions and mother-to-child transmission, both of which are, of course, mother-to-child transmission has been common in all countries all over the world, but same-sex interaction is now an increasing element in the HIV epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. We could incorporate different viral levels and age levels, so you can imagine that someone who was recently infected with HIV would spread the disease much more easily than someone who might have been infected a long time ago because they have higher viral levels of the disease. Age levels might be interesting to look at. Tracking resistant strains of HIV, and this is taking into concern the issue of compliance with HIV treatment, is that not everyone is going to comply, and so you're going to get a lot of drug resistance. And incorporating marital status compartments might also be interesting because you can imagine that single people might be having a different number of sexual interactions than married people in the year, and a different type of sexual interaction, protected versus non-protected. So I'd just like to briefly acknowledge these people, my advisor and my secondary reader, Professor Pills and Professor Haushalter, respectively. So thank you for listening.
Questions for Nadia?
Suppose you do something like integrate the death rate due to HIV over time for different models. Like we're basically for these different treatment strategies counting the number of people total who die from HIV. Do you know which one's best under that kind of?
I honestly did not look into that, and it's something I probably should have, but just didn't have the time. But I mean, just from what I see, I think it would agree with these results. That's just a guess. Guess to hear.
So, could you possibly apply this model to do simulations of already published data on things that have already occurred in the history of HIV/AIDS epidemiology to test the model for already known phenomena?
That's actually a really good question, and something that I actually sought out to do when I began. I wanted to see if we had programmed the model with data from 1989, could we accurately predict what's happening today? From what I saw, my model is actually doing that without me doing much work or fiddling. So it seems to represent the dynamics pretty well so far. And I tried to make it also as general as possible so that you could apply it to different epidemics across the world as well. Yeah.
So I have two questions that are related. One is, what assumptions did you make about interactions between rural people and urban people? And then my second question was, when we talk about preferential treatment, were you assuming that a certain percentage of the population was getting it, or were you assuming that a certain number of each group was getting the treatment?
Those are very good questions. I probably should have addressed them. To answer your second question first, it was a proportion of the population that was being preferentially treated. So in each of those cases, I was assuming that 30% of all women or 30% of all people in rural areas were being treated.
So if there were fewer people in rural areas, that could also account for why.
Correct. And to answer your second question, I was assuming that people who were living in rural populations were having less interactions than those living in urban populations, simply because of the density that you would expect in each of those areas. And we were also assuming that men in the urban areas were more sexually active than men in the rural areas. So those are the two main assumptions that we had between urban and rural areas.
But you should say what your total population numbers were, though, because part of the question is, do you have
True.
only 5 rural
So you can imagine that the urban population was on the order of millions, and the rural
to that, I mean, did you normalize your treatment constants to the population ratios? I mean, did you treat a higher percentage of rural people?
Right, so in each of those simulations, that's exactly what was being done. The proportion of the population that was being treated was being changed in each of them.
For the urban versus rural preferential treatment,
Oh.
did you treat a higher percentage
Oh,
of
I see what
rural?
you're saying. No, actually, we didn't. We just kept the same proportion. Yes.
Was the World Health Organization recommendations, were they saying to treat both rural and urban, or was
So they were just actually listing, I can go all the way back. They were actually just listing different subgroups they thought were disadvantaged. So the list that they came up with was women, children, poor, rural, sex workers, injection drug users. But to me, what seemed logical was that if you are going to go for a proportion of the subgroup like women, then you could also take that to mean, you know, the proportion of the subgroup in this area or the proportion of the subgroup in this area. From our experience in Uganda, I think there is a very big divide between treating those who are in the city and those who are treating people who are out in rural areas. You have to take a motorcycle and go out there and spend your whole day out there distributing medication, as opposed to sitting in your clinic and just waiting for people to come in. So it's a very different strategy. And it would take a lot more money, honestly, to go out to the rural areas than just to sit in your clinic and wait for people.
so from a policy perspective,